on foot, waving their scarlet cloaks before the bull, and vaulting lightly over the barrier when he charged them. As for the bull himself, he was just like a live bull, though he was only made of wickerwork and stretched hide, and sometimes insisted on running around the area on his hind legs, which no live bull ever dreams of doing. He made a splendid fight of it, too, and the children got so excited that they stood up on the benches and waved their lace handkerchiefs and cried out, "Bravo, Toro! Bravo, Toro!" just as sensibly as if they had been grown-up people. At last, however, after a prolonged combat, during which several of the hobby horses were gored through and through, and their riders dismounted, the young Count of Tierra Nueva brought the bull to his knees, and having obtained permission from the Infanta to give the coup de grace, he plunged his wooden sword into the neck of the animal with such violence that the head came right off, and disclosed the laughing face of little Monsieur de Lorraine, the son of the French ambassador at Madrid. The area was then cleared amidst much applause, and the dead hobby horses dragged solemnly away by two Moorish pages in yellow and black liveries, and after a short interlude, during which a French posture master performed upon the tightrope, some Italian puppets appeared in the semi-classical tragedy of Safonisba on the stage of a small theatre that had been built up for the purpose. They acted so well, and their gestures were so extremely natural, that at the close of the play the eyes of the Infanta were quite dim with tears. Indeed, some of the children really cried, and had to be comforted with sweetmeats, and the Grand Inquisitor himself was so affected that he could not help saying to Don Pedro that it seemed to him intolerable that things made simply out of wood and colored wax, and worked mechanically by wires, should be so unhappy and meet with such terrible misfortunes. An African juggler followed, who brought in a large flat basket covered with a red cloth, and having placed it in the center of the arena, he took from his turban a curious reed pipe and blew through it. In a few moments the cloth began to move, and as the pipe grew shriller and shriller, two green and gold snakes put out their strange wedge-shaped heads and rose slowly up, swaying to and fro with the music as a plant sways in the water. The children, however, were rather frightened at their spotted hoods and quick-darting tongues, and were much more pleased when the juggler made a tiny orange tree grow out of the sand, and bear pretty white blossoms and clusters of real fruit, and when he took the fan of the little daughter of the Marquis de la Torres and changed it into a bluebird that flew all around the pavilion and sang, their delight and amazement knew no bounds. The solemn minuet, too, performed by the dancing boys from the church of Nuestra Senora del Pilar, was charming. The Infanta had never before seen this wonderful ceremony, which takes place every year at Maytime in front of the high altar of the Virgin and in her honor. And indeed none of the royal family of Spain had entered the great cathedral of Saragossa since a mad priest, supposed by many to have been in the pay of Elizabeth of England, had tried to administer a poisoned wafer to the Prince of Asturias. So she had known only by hearsay of Our Lady's Dance, as it was called, and it certainly was a beautiful sight. The boys wore old-fashioned court dresses of white velvet, and their curious three-cornered hats were fringed with silver and surmounted with huge plumes of ostrich feathers. The dazzling whiteness of their costumes, as they moved about in the sunlight, being still more accentuated by their swarthy faces and long black hair. Everybody was fascinated by the grave dignity with which they moved through the intricate figures of the dance, and by the elaborate grace of their slow gestures and stately bows, and when they had finished their performance and doffed their great plumed hats to the Infanta, she acknowledged their reverence with much courtesy, and made a vow that she would send a large wax candle to the shrine of Our Lady of Pilar in return for the pleasure that she had given her. A troop of handsome Egyptians, as the gypsies were termed in those days, then advanced into the arena, and sitting down cross-legs in a circle, began to play softly upon their zithers, moving their bodies to the tune, and humming almost below their breath a low dreamy air. When they caught sight of Don Pedro they scowled at him, and some of them looked terrified, for only a few weeks before he had had two of their tribe hanged for sorcery in the market-place at Seville. But the pretty Infanta charmed them as she leaned back, peeping over her fan with her great blue eyes, and they felt sure that one so lovely as she was could never be cruel to anybody. So they played on very gently, and just touching the cords of the zithers with their long pointed nails, and their heads began to nod as though they were falling asleep. Suddenly, with a cry so shrill that all the children were startled, and Don Pedro's hand clutched the agate pommel of his dagger, They leapt to their feet and whirled madly round the enclosure, beating their tambourines, and chaunting some wild love song in their strange guttural language. Then at another signal they all flung themselves again to the ground, and lay there quite still, the dull strumming of the zithers being the only sound that broke the silence. After that they had done this several times, they disappeared for a moment, and came back leading a brown shaggy bear by a chain, and carrying on their shoulders some little Barbary apes. The bear stood upon his head with the utmost gravity, and the wizened apes played all kinds of amusing tricks with two gipsy boys who seemed to be their masters, and fought with tiny swords, and fired off guns, and went through a regular soldier's drill, just like the king's own bodyguard. In fact, the gipsies were a great success. But the funniest part of the whole morning's entertainment was undoubtedly the dancing of the little dwarf. When he stumbled into the arena, waddling on his crooked legs, and wagging his huge misshapen head from side to side, the children went off into a loud shout of delight, and the Infanta herself laughed so much that the Camera was obliged to remind her that, although there were many precedents in Spain for a king's daughter weeping before her equals, there were none for a princess of the blood royal making so merry before those who were her inferiors in birth. The dwarf, however, was really quite irresistible, and even at the Spanish court, always noted for its cultivated passion for the horrible, so fantastic a little monster had never been seen. It was his first appearance, too. He had been discovered only the day before, running wild through the forest, by two of the nobles who happened to have been hunting in a remote part of the great cork wood that surrounded the town, and had been carried off by them to the palace as a surprise for the Infanta, his father, who was a poor charcoal burner, being but too well pleased to get rid of so ugly and useless a child. Perhaps the most amusing thing about him was his complete unconsciousness of his own grotesque appearance. Indeed, he seemed quite happy and full of the highest spirits. When the children laughed, he laughed as freely and as joyously as any of them, and at the close of each dance he made them each the funniest of bows, smiling and nodding at them just as if he was really one of themselves, and not a little misshapen thing that nature in some humorous mood had fashioned for others to mock at. As for the Infanta, she absolutely fascinated him. He could not keep his eyes off her, and seemed to dance for her alone. And when, at the close of the performance, remembering how she had seen the great ladies of the court throw bouquets to Caffarelli, the famous Italian treble, whom the Pope had sent from his own chapel to Madrid that he might cure the king's melancholy by the sweetness of his voice, she took out of her hair the beautiful white rose, and, partly for a jest and partly to tease the Camera, threw it to him across the arena with her sweetest smile. He took the whole matter quite seriously, and pressing the flower to his rough, coarse lips, he put his hand upon his heart, and sank on one knee before her, grinning from ear to ear, and with his little bright eyes sparkling with pleasure. This so upset the gravity of the Infanta that she kept on laughing long after the little dwarf had ran out of the arena, and expressed a desire to her uncle that the dance should be immediately repeated. The Camera, however, on the plea that the sun was too hot, decided that it would be better that her Highness should return without delay to the palace, where a wonderful feast had been already prepared for her, including a real birthday cake with her own initials worked all over it in painted sugar, and a lovely silver flag waving from the top. The Infanta accordingly rose up with much dignity, and having given orders that the little dwarf was to dance again for her after the hour of siesta, and conveyed her thanks to the young Count of Tierra Nueva for his charming reception, she went back to her apartments, the children following in the same order in which they had entered. Now when the little dwarf heard that he was to dance a second time before the Infanta, and by her own express command, he was so proud that he ran out into the garden, kissing the white rose in an absurd ecstasy of pleasure, and making the most uncouth and clumsy gestures of delight. The flowers were quite indignant at his daring to intrude into their beautiful home, and when they saw him capering up and down the walks, and waving his arms above his head in such a ridiculous manner, they could not restrain their feelings any longer. "He is really far too ugly to be allowed to play in any place where we are," cried the tulips. "He should drink poppy juice and go to sleep for 1,000 years," said the great scarlet lilies, and they grew quite hot and angry. "He is a perfect horror!" screamed the cactus. "Why, he is twisted and stumpy, and his head is completely out of proportion with his legs. Really, he makes me feel prickly all over, and if he comes near me I will sting him with my thorns." "And he has actually got one of my best blooms!" exclaimed the white rose tree.